We begin our show with the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, where world leaders have been meeting for the last 2 weeks in an effort to reach a consensus on how to stop global heating. The private sector is promising to spend unprecedented amounts of money to wean the world economy off fossil fuels. Governments have also unveiled their roadmaps to a more sustainable future. But many of those promises have been criticized by activists who want to see more ambitious targets being set. Paolo Montecillo reports.
I now declare open the 10th meeting of COP26.
It was billed as the last chance to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this year's climate conference produced some historic commitments. One making headlines was a deal between the world's two largest polluters, China and the US, to protect forests, reduce methane emissions, and phase out coal.
The United States and China have no shortage of differences, but on climate, cooperation is the only way to get this job done.
Leading the way for the private sector are New York's Rockefeller Foundation, Swedish furniture maker IKEA, and Amazon's billionaire founder Jeff Bezos. They've formed an alliance to help emerging nations shift away from fossil fuels and plan to spend $100 billion over the next 10 years to make it happen. Additionally, the Bezos Earth Fund is also donating $2 billion to help restore some of the planet's damaged and threatened ecosystems.
It's not just planting trees, it is restoring ecosystems. And so standards now are clear what they should be. Not everybody adheres to them, but I can assure you that we at the Bezos Earth Fund absolutely will be following those very high standards.
The most generous pledge of all was brokered by former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney. He's leading a coalition of financial institutions promising to deploy $130 trillion to reduce carbon emissions. That'll come in the form of loans for and investments in sustainable businesses.
Up until today, there was not enough money in the world to fund the transition, and this is a watershed. Okay, and so now it's plugging it in.
Governments are coming under even more pressure to step up. In particular, rich nations have failed to make good on a pledge to provide $100 billion in funding per year to help less wealthy countries deal with the climate crisis. But activists say that amount falls far short of what's needed, given the worsening effects of global heating and how slowly the world has moved to address it. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
And for more on this, Eddy Perez joins us from Glasgow. He's the International Climate Diplomacy Manager at Climate Action Network Canada. Welcome to the show, Eddy. Now, first of all, research by the Climate Action Network found global temperatures are on track to rise 2.4 degrees Celsius this century based on the short-term targets set out by governments currently. Explain to us, what does that mean for lives and livelihoods of people around the world?
Thank you very much for the invitation to the show. Essentially, we are towards an increase of global temperature that goes beyond 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That is what the UNFCCC synthesis report has said. Every UN report, one after the other, says the same thing. We are not in the right direction. We need to radically change course. And at this moment, at these discussions, we're actually confirming some of those fears that the young generation is expressing at this summit in Glasgow, that even though the science is telling us to move faster, at this process, we're still stuck. And so, the people that have come from all over the world, they bring stories of losses and damages that will continue to increase and impact our lives everywhere. It goes from the fires in British Columbia and in Canada to the floods in Germany and in Greece, to the problems of food nutrition in Africa. And these losses and damages are actually in this process sometimes ignored, and there's no funding to tackle it. So clearly, the scientific research that we have is not met with the political willingness necessary to tackle this crisis.
Now, Eddie, talking about funding, we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars being pledged at this event alone, and yet activists such as yourself say that's not nearly enough. How much money do we really need, or is it even just about the money?
It is about the money. It is about the money, but it's also about trust. We do know that the funds are there, but they're used for other reasons. You know, the International Energy Agency told us that we need $4 trillion a year to unlock the energy transition. The UNEP report has told us that when it comes to adaptation, the gap when it comes to finance, it goes from $150 billion to more than 300 billion over the next decade, every single year. The money is there. We have seen countries, rich countries like my own in Canada, use billions of dollars as part of their recovery packages. We know Canada is one of those countries that continue to subsidize fossil fuels. It is a question of choices. Canada remains one of those countries that has not yet committed its fair share when it comes to climate financing. And so there are two things here. The first one is, why is it that these rich nations don't want to step up funding? And why is it that we see on the other side of this venue banks coming and saying that they want to put to the service of the climate $130 trillion, $130 trillion in assets for net zero, while at the same time continuing to use their resources to fund fossil fuels. So we do see a huge inconsistency at the moment, and it would be a shame that the UK presidency doesn't step up and countries here don't step up to resolve that gap that remains very big in Glasgow.
Now, Eddie, talking about financial institutions, we know that some multilateral agencies like the IMF and the World Bank have stopped funding for coal power projects and other fossil fuel projects. Do you think they're doing enough? Or in other words, what else would you like them to see doing, especially in terms of incentivizing developing nations to be more proactive in this fight?
This, I think it's important to make sure that these efforts are consistent. When it comes to financing coal, financing oil and gas, there were many announcements here in Glasgow. Canada, for example, decided that they would stop international fossil fuel finance funding from public resources. That is a welcome move. Certainly, any effort that takes us away from the addiction to coal and to fossil fuels is important. But Canada did not say that they would stop subsidizing the oil and gas in Canada at the domestic level. So yeah, here that is one of the inconsistencies, and that grows across international agencies, multilateral development banks. They do one thing with their money, and then the majority of their funds go to fossil fuels. So these inconsistencies are part of the reason why, when it comes to finance, there's still a trust gap that needs to be fixed. Because what vulnerable nations are telling here, what they're telling us here is that they need access to climate finance. They're getting less than 5% of climate financing. And that is totally unacceptable. And that is the reason why we need to fight for much more funding, because the vulnerable countries are fighting for their survival.
All right, much to do there then to bridge not just a financing gap, but also a trust gap. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Eddy Perez there from the Climate Action Network Canada.